The gate had not moved in 4 years, and the whole of Harlan County, Texas, knew better than to test it. The summer of 1882 pressed down on the land like a hot iron, flattening the buffalo grass, baking the red clay roads into something harder than fired brick, and wringing every last drop of patience from every living creature that tried to endure it. The cattle along the Pecos River stood shoulder to shoulder at the water's edge, too tired and too hot to fight for position, and the jackrabbits had long since retreated to whatever shade the mesquite thickets could provide. It was the kind of summer that made a person wonder what they had ever done to deserve Texas, and it was precisely the kind of summer that brought a stray calf wandering across 3 miles of open range, through 2 dry creek beds, and eventually through a gap in a fence line that nobody had been permitted to approach in half a decade. Wilhelmina Kendrick found the calf on a Tuesday morning, which she would later remember as the most significant Tuesday of her entire life, though she had no way of knowing that at the time. She had been riding the eastern boundary of her family's property. What remained of her family's property after 3 years of drought, 1 bad cattle season, and the lingering financial shadow her father had left behind when he died checking for breaks in the fence line the way her father had taught her, methodical and unhurried, letting her horse Biscuit set the pace. Biscuit was a buckskin mare of considerable age and considerable wisdom, and she had a way of slowing down near trouble before Wilhelmina had even spotted it, which was how they had avoided 2 rattlesnakes and 1 questionable mud bog that summer alone. It was Biscuit who first noticed the calf. The mare's ears came forward, and she let out a low, curious sound, and Wilhelmina looked up from the fence post she had been examining to see a red-and-white calf standing in the shade of a half-dead cottonwood tree, shaking its tail and blinking at her with the wide, bewildered eyes of an animal that had absolutely no idea how it had arrived at this particular place in the world. The calf was young, maybe 4 months, with a brand on its left hip that Wilhelmina recognized immediately. She had grown up in Harlan County. She knew every brand within 20 miles. The D inside a circle belonged to Chester Dawson. She sat still for a moment, and Biscuit stood still beneath her, and the calf continued blinking, and the heat shimmered off the ground in slow, liquid waves. Chester Dawson's land. She turned in her saddle and looked north, across the open range, and she could see it from here if she shaded her eyes, the fence line that marked the boundary of the Dawson property, and beyond it, the dark shape of a ranch house set back from a long dirt road, and at the road's entrance, a gate made of iron and weathered timber that had not opened for 4 years. Every person in Harlan County could tell you what they had heard about why Chester Dawson had closed that gate. They could tell you in the same way people told stories around a fire, with some certainty about the outline and considerable uncertainty about the details. They said his wife had died. They said it had been sudden and terrible. They said he had buried her on the property and never spoken of her again, and that somewhere in the grief that followed, he had simply decided that the world outside his fence was no longer any business of his, and his business was no longer any business of the world. 4 years of that. 4 years of supplies delivered and left at the gate. 4 years of no visitors, no socials, no church appearances. 4 years of a gate that stayed closed. Wilhelmina had been 22 when it happened, newly arrived back in Harlan County after 2 years at a school in San Antonio that her father had stretched himself financially thin to provide for her. And she had known Chester Dawson the way everyone in a small county knew everyone else. Not well, but solidly, the way you know the names of the mountains on the horizon. He had been older than her by 6 years, a quiet and serious man who ran his cattle operation with a precision that other ranchers quietly envied, and he had married a woman named Clara Beaumont from up near Abilene, and they had seemed to Wilhelmina, on the few occasions she had seen them together, like 2 people who had made a genuine and reasonable peace with the world. Then Clara had died, and the gate had closed, and 4 years had passed, and now there was a calf standing under a cottonwood tree that needed to go home. Wilhelmina pressed her lips together, made a decision, and clicked her tongue at Biscuit. Getting the calf to cooperate was not a simple enterprise. It took the better part of 40 minutes, a length of rope from her saddlebag, and the kind of patient, circular maneuvering that made her think fondly of every experienced cowhands she had ever watched work cattle and less fondly of every novice she had ever seen try to rush the process. But eventually the calf was moving alongside Biscuit in a reasonable direction, and they crossed the open range toward the Dawson fence line, and Wilhelmina did not let herself think too hard about what she was doing. She was returning a stray calf. That was a simple, neighborly act. There was nothing complicated about it. She was going to ride to that gate, tell whoever answered, some ranch hand likely, since Chester Dawson himself surely did not come to the gate, that she had found his calf, hand the animal over, and ride back home. The gate was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had never been close to it before, and the stories had given it dimensions in her imagination that were different from the reality. It was a solid structure, iron post sunk deep into the ground and connected by a crossbar of heavy timber, with a chain and a padlock securing the latch. The fence line on either side of it was in good repair. She noted that automatically, the way anyone raised on a ranch noted fence lines, new posts where old ones had rotted, wire strung tight and even. Whoever was maintaining the Dawson property was doing it properly. On the other side of the gate, the road ran straight and unwavering for a quarter-mile toward a cluster of buildings that constituted the ranch headquarters, and she could see smoke rising thin and steady from the main house chimney, which struck her as an odd thing on a day as hot as this one. She brought Biscuit to a stop in front of the gate, the calf pressing against the mare's flank, and she raised her voice. "Hello, the ranch," she called out, the traditional announcement that you were there and you were not a threat, the particular words that every person in the West learned the way they learned to walk. Nothing happened for a moment. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the road and began walking toward her. She had expected a ranch hand. She had prepared herself for a ranch hand, someone she could hand the calf to with a brief word and a nod, completing the whole transaction in under 5 minutes. What she had not prepared herself for was the possibility that Chester Dawson himself might be the person who answered. But it was Chester Dawson. She recognized him as he came closer, though he was changed from what she remembered. He was 34 now, she calculated quickly, and the years had done what years did to a man who worked hard in hard country, deepened the lines around his eyes, darkened his skin to the color of saddle leather, put more deliberate weight into the way he moved. He was broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor recently. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, canvas trousers worn pale at the knees, and boots that had covered a great deal of ground. He walked with the unhurried, economical stride of someone who had learned long ago that rushing accomplished nothing in heat like this. He stopped on his side of the gate and looked at her with dark eyes that were careful and still, the way the surface of water is still when it is very deep. "Miss Kendrick," he said. She was surprised he knew her name. She had not been sure he would recognize her after 4 years of near-complete isolation, but his expression suggested that he was not surprised to see her, exactly more that he was measuring the situation, deciding what it was and what it required of him. "Mr. Dawson," she said. "I found one of yours about 3 miles south near the old Kendrick East fence. He had worked his way through a gap, I think." She gestured at the calf, who was now attempting to investigate Biscuit's ear with considerable enthusiasm. Chester Dawson looked at the calf for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not quite warmth, not quite the absence of it, something in between that she could not name. "That would be Little Red," he said. "He has a talent for finding the impossible way out of wherever he is supposed to be." "I can relate to that feeling," Wilhelmina said, and was immediately surprised that she had said it, because it was not the kind of thing she had planned to say. It was just true, and it had come out before she had thought about it. Chester Dawson looked at her for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then he did something that, by all accounts, by the accounts of everyone in Harlan County who had been speculating about this gate for 4 years, should have been impossible. He reached down, lifted the chain from the post, pressed the latch, and pushed the gate open. He pushed it open wide. Wilhelmina sat on Biscuit and absorbed this fact and tried to look as though it was a perfectly ordinary occurrence. "Bring him through," Chester said. "I'll put him in the pen and you can water your horse before you head back." It's a long ride in this heat. She rode through the gate. She told herself later that she had not felt the significance of it in that moment, but that was not entirely true. There was something in the way the iron and timber swung open slowly, like something that had been still so long it had forgotten how to move easily, that made her breath catch very slightly in her chest. She rode through, and he pushed the gate closed behind her, though he did not rechain it, she noticed. The road to the house was lined on one side with a row of cottonwoods that were getting their water from somewhere underground and thriving because of it, and on the other side with the remains of what had once been a kitchen garden. A few struggling tomato plants, a hopeful row of peppers, some herbs that had survived through what appeared to be pure stubbornness. The ranch buildings were well kept and functional, the kind of place where a person had put practicality ahead of aesthetics, but had not entirely abandoned the idea that a thing could be both useful and decent. The barn was large and sound, the corrals were solid, and the house itself was a 2-story structure of whitewashed timber with a wide front porch that ran the full length of the building. Chester led them to a pen near the barn and opened the gate, and the calf trotted inside with the relief of an animal that recognized home, immediately settling in beside a larger cow, who greeted it with the long-suffering patience of a mother who had long since stopped being surprised by her offspring's adventures. "His mother," Chester said, "she has been worried." "She does not look worried," Wilhelmina observed. "The cow was already grazing with complete serenity. She hides it well." A pause. "She takes after her calf in that." It took Wilhelmina a second to understand that this was humor, dry and quiet and entirely unexpected, and when she did, she found herself smiling before she could stop herself. "The water trough is around that side," he said, gesturing, and she dismounted and led Biscuit around to where he had indicated. There was a trough fed by a windmill pump, the blades turning slowly in what little breeze existed, and the water was cool and clear when she cupped a handful to her own face, while Biscuit drank with single-minded concentration. Chester Dawson brought a tin cup from somewhere and held it out to her, already filled with water from what she assumed was the house pump. She took it and drank and was grateful, because the ride had been long and hot and she had not thought to bring enough water. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing him back." They stood in the shade of the barn wall, which at this hour of the day provided a narrow strip of relief from the direct sun, and there was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable in the way silences between near strangers sometimes were. It was more like the silence of two people who had arrived somewhere unexpected and were both taking a moment to look around. "I heard you have been running the Kendrick place on your own," Chester said eventually, "since your father passed." "That is correct," she said. "About 8 months now." "How is it going?" It was a direct question, and she appreciated directness, so she gave him a direct answer. "Hard. The drought hit us badly the last 2 years, and my father had some debts I did not know about in full until after he was gone. But we have 140 head still, and I have 2 good hands, and I am still standing." He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "Your father was a good man," he said. "He had some difficult years." "Yes," she said simply, because that was the whole of it. Another silence, and then Chester Dawson did another unexpected thing. "Would you like to sit on the porch a minute?" he said. "Out of the sun." She should have said no. She had fence lined to finish checking and other work waiting and no particular reason to linger. She was aware, faintly, that she was inside a gate that 4 years of county gossip had made into something legendary, and that the man standing beside her was someone the county had turned into something of a legend himself, a figure of grief and mystery, half cautionary tale and half romantic tragedy, depending on who was doing the telling. "All right," she said. The porch was exactly as she would have imagined it if she had tried 2 wooden chairs, a small table between them, a view of the south pasture and the mountains in the far distance. The mountains that from this angle were a dark blue shadow on the horizon, permanent and enormous and entirely indifferent to the human dramas played out beneath them. She took the chair on the left because it seemed slightly more shaded, and Chester Dawson took the other, and he brought out another cup of water that she realized after a moment was actually lemonade, made from reconstituted powder by the taste of it, but cold and sweet and perfect for the heat. "You make lemonade," she said. "I had a craving," he said, with the absolute flatness of a man who was not going to elaborate. She thought she might be smiling again. She kept her face arranged carefully. They sat and looked at the south pasture, where a small herd of cattle was visible in the distance, and the silence stretched out again, but this time it was different. Less the silence of 2 strangers and more the silence of 2 people who were both aware at the same moment that something had shifted, though neither of them could have said exactly what. "I should be getting back," she said, when she judged that enough time had passed that leaving would be natural and not abrupt. "I will walk you to your horse," he said. He walked her to Biscuit and held the mare while Wilhelmina mounted, and when she was settled and had gathered the reins, she looked down at him and he looked up at her, and for a moment the whole sun-baked, wind-dried, history-weighted landscape of Harlan County was very quiet. "If he gets out again," Chester said, "you are welcome to bring him back." "I will keep that in mind," she said. She rode back through the gate which he opened for her, and when she was through she turned in the saddle to look back. He was still standing there, holding the gate, watching her go. He had not closed it yet. She turned Biscuit south and rode home, and she thought about lemonade and dry humor and dark eyes that were careful and still, and she told herself that she was making something significant out of something that was simply a practical transaction between neighbors, and she almost believed herself. Almost. Harlan County, being the size that it was and the kind of place that it was, had a way of knowing things almost before they happened. The general store in the town of Harlan, which was not so much a town as it was a collection of buildings with ambitions, was operated by a man named Floyd Cutler, who had the memory of a courthouse ledger and the conversational range of a man who had been in one place his entire life and intended to stay there. It was at Floyd's store, 3 days after Wilhelmina's visit to the Dawson property, that word began to move through the county in the way word always moved in small places, not quickly, but thoroughly, the way water found its way through apparently solid rock. Wilhelmina herself was responsible for this, though entirely without intention. She had come to Floyd's for supplies: flour, coffee, salt pork, a new length of chain for the east fence gate, and Floyd had made the observation, in the way Floyd always made observations, that she had ridden the East Range recently, and she had confirmed this, and he had asked if she had seen anything interesting out that direction, and she had mentioned with what she believed was perfect neutrality that she had found a Dawson calf and returned it. Floyd had said, "Is that right?" in a tone that Wilhelmina recognized 3 days later, when her nearest neighbor Dorothea Pratt came visiting with a pie and a great deal of questions, as the tone of a man who had discovered something he considered significant. Dorothea Pratt was 61 years old, had been born in Missouri, had come to Texas with a husband and 3 children 40 years ago, had buried the husband and raised the children and built a life on sheer force of will, and she was one of those women who was genuinely, warmly interested in other people's business in a way that was somehow never quite as infuriating as it ought to have been. She sat on Wilhelmina's porch and ate her own pie and said, So you rode out to the Dawson property, in the particular tone of a woman who already knew this. I found a calf, Wilhelmina said with emphasis. And he opened the gate, Dorothea said. Wilhelmina looked at her. Floyd Cutler has a considerable gift for extrapolation. Floyd Cutler did not say anything about a gate being opened. I am extrapolating myself. Dorothea looked pleased with this. Because if he had not opened it, you would not have been able to return the calf, and you would have said, I left the calf at the gate. You said you returned the calf, which means you went through. Wilhelmina was quiet for a moment, because this was entirely correct logic and she could not argue with it. He opened the gate, she confirmed. Dorothea set down her fork and looked at Wilhelmina with an expression of such concentrated significance that Wilhelmina felt the need to straighten in her chair. Child, Dorothea said, in 4 years that man has not opened that gate for anyone. Not the preacher, not the doctor. When his hand got infected, he treated it himself. Apparently not the county assessor, not anyone. He opened it to get his calf back, Wilhelmina said. He could have met you at the gate and taken the calf, Dorothea pointed out. He did not have to let you in. Wilhelmina had thought about this. She had been thinking about it in the quiet margins of days full of work, in the way that a question you do not want to look at directly still manages to make itself present in your peripheral vision. He was being neighborly, she said. Wilhelmina, Dorothea said, with the patience of a woman who had raised 3 children through all their most elaborate self-deceptions. When was the last time you talked to someone who made you smile twice in a single afternoon? This was an unfair question because it was also unanswerable. Wilhelmina picked up her own fork and focused on the pie. It was good lemonade, she said finally. Dorothea smiled the smile of a woman who knew when she had made her point and when to stop pressing it. He made lemonade, she said softly, and that was all. Wilhelmina did not ride out toward the Dawson property for the next 2 weeks. She had work enough to occupy her fully, and the draining of the creek on the south end of the property that had been threatening for a month finally reached the point of crisis and required 3 days of hard work from herself and her 2 hands, Eli Grover and young Samson Webb, to redirect adequately. Eli was 45. A steady and reliable man who had worked the Kendrick ranch since before Wilhelmina was born, and Samson was 19, a tall and earnest young man from a freedman family who had come to work for her after the previous spring, when she had needed help and had offered fair wages, and had not made him feel the various kinds of wrong that other employers in the county had made him feel, and who had in the months since become someone she trusted as thoroughly as she trusted Eli. Between the creek drainage and the regular demands of running a cattle operation in a drought year with limited resources, 2 weeks passed in the way that hard-working weeks passed, quickly in terms of hours and slowly in terms of exhaustion. She was checking the water levels in the north tank on a Thursday evening when she heard a horse on the road. This was not so unusual. The road that passed the Kendrick property connected several other ranches further south to the Harlan Road, but something about the particular sound made her look up from what she was doing, and she saw Chester Dawson riding a gray horse along the fence line at a distance that was close enough to be intentional and far enough to be deniable. He pulled up when he saw her, and she walked to the fence, and they stood on opposite sides of it in the long golden light of early evening, and she noticed that he was carrying something in his left hand, a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "I was coming to bring you something," he said, which was unexpectedly direct and clearly true. "What were you going to do if I was not out here?" she asked. "Leave it at your gate," he said, "though I hoped I would not have to." She reached over the fence, the Kendrick fence, which was hers, which did not have the same 4-year weight of story that his did, and took the bundle when he held it out. She unwrapped it to find a jar of honey and 2 small wax papers folded around what turned out to be 2 pieces of dried apple cake. She looked up at him. "Little Red's mother has 4 hives now," he said, "of the honey. She has always been an industrious animal." He paused. "I was not sure what you liked for the cake. Dried apple was what I had." "I like dried apple very much," she said honestly, because she did. He nodded. A muscle moved in his jaw in the way it did on a man who had something more to say and was deciding whether to say it. She waited, because she had learned in 2 weeks of thinking about this that Chester Dawson was not a man to be pushed. And besides, the evening light on the mountains was very beautiful, and she was not in a hurry to go inside. "I found myself thinking," he said finally, "that it would not be unreasonable if you had any fencing questions or any trouble on the East Range to send word. I have some experience with drainage issues if that would be of use." He had, she realized, clearly observed the drainage work she had been doing. You could see it from this road if you were paying attention. He had been paying attention. "I might take you up on that," she said carefully. "If something comes up." He looked at her directly. His eyes in the evening light were not just dark. They were a kind of dark that had some warmth in it, the way old timber is dark but still warm to the touch. "Miss Kendrick," he said, "I am aware that I have been something of a ghost in this county for several years. I am aware that I have been something people talk about." Started again. "I am not entirely sure how to proceed with ordinary things any longer. I am somewhat out of practice." The honesty of this hit her somewhere behind her sternum, sudden and clean. "I think ordinary things are mostly just one small thing at a time," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his face changed, a very small thing, the way a door that has been slightly ajar opens a fraction further. "I think you may be right about that," he said. He rode on a few minutes after that, south toward the Harlan Road, and she watched him go and then looked down at the jar of honey in her hands and the 2 pieces of dried apple cake. And she thought that the most unexpected things in life arrived exactly like this, on ordinary evenings, over ordinary fence lines, in the form of honey and cake and carefully honest words from a man who was out of practice with ordinary things. She ate 1 piece of cake on the way back to the house and saved the other for the morning, and she slept better that night than she had in months. The summer burned along. Chester Dawson came to help with a stretch of fence on the North Range that had come down in a brief, violent storm that swept through Harlan County on a Friday in late July, bringing more lightning than rain, which was the most frustrating kind of storm. He came with 2 of his own hands, quiet men named Tors and Bright, who worked with the efficient silence of people who had been working together long enough to communicate without words, and they spent a full day replacing posts and restringing wire. And at noon, Wilhelmina brought food out to all of them from the house, and they sat in the minimal shade of the work wagon and ate, and Chester sat near her but not improperly near, and they talked. They talked, that afternoon, in the way that 2 people talk when they are discovering that they have more in common than geography. They talked about cattle, because that was the immediate practical subject, but they moved from there into all the small territories of opinion and preference and experience that make up a person. The way Chester had grown up in this county, son of a man who had built the Dawson Ranch from nothing in the 1850s, working ground that had been raw and wild and dangerous. And the way Wilhelmina had grown up being told she was too interested in the ranch work and not interested enough in the things a young woman was supposed to be interested in, and how she had never particularly been able to make herself care about that. "My mother wanted me to marry young," she said. "She died when I was 16. I sometimes think she would have been relieved to know I turned out as capable as I did, and simultaneously horrified by the manner of it." "My father would have called you a good hand," Chester said, which in ranching country was the highest compliment available, and which she received as such. Tors and Bright were finishing the last section of fence, and Eli and Samson were coiling the remaining wire, and the long afternoon was beginning to tilt toward evening, and in the particular quiet of a day's work winding down, Chester said something that he said carefully, the way a person says something they have been sitting with for a while. "Clara used to say that this county felt like a separate country," he said, "that once you were inside it the rest of the world receded to something theoretical. It was the first time she had heard him say his wife's name. She did not move or change her expression, understanding instinctively that this required stillness. "That is a perceptive observation," she said quietly. "She was a perceptive person," he said. He was looking at the mountains. "She died of a fever. It came fast. In 4 days she was gone, and he stopped. Started again with the careful deliberateness of a man navigating terrain he did not fully trust. I was not prepared for how completely a life could change in 4 days. I had not understood until then how much of what I thought was just me was actually us." Wilhelmina said nothing, because nothing was the right thing to say. "I'm not telling you this because I think you need to know it," he said, after a moment. "I am telling you because I think it is relevant to where I am now, and I would rather say it plainly than have it be something between us that neither of us names." She looked at him then, and he was looking at her, and the directness of it was like something physical, like walking out of shade into sun. "I appreciate that," she said. "Plain is better." He nodded slowly. "You are not afraid of much, are you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "I am afraid of the drought getting worse," she said. "I am afraid of losing the ranch. I am afraid of making decisions that I cannot undo." A pause. "People, though, no, people are just people." "I used to feel that way," he said. "I am working my way back toward it." The crew finished and packed up in the way that people who have done a job well finish and pack up, with the quiet satisfaction of completed work. And Chester's men loaded the wagon and prepared to ride. And Chester stood beside his gray horse and looked at Wilhelmina. And she stood on her side of the invisible line between farewell and something else, and he said, "Would you come to supper on Saturday? Nothing elaborate. I cook plainly." The question was simple, and the implications of it were not simple at all, and they both knew it, and she appreciated that he did not pretend otherwise. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." She dressed for Saturday's supper with the particular care of a woman who is trying to look as though she has not taken particular care. She had one good dress that was not purely practical, a deep blue calico that she had bought in San Antonio 2 years before her father died, on an occasion when she had briefly allowed herself to spend money on something that was only for pleasure. And she put it on and looked at herself in the mirror in her bedroom and thought she looked like herself, which was the best possible result. Eli, when she rode out, looked at the dress and looked at the direction she was riding and said nothing except "back before full dark, I hope," in the tone of a man who had helped raise her from the age of 12 and was entitled to one mild observation. "Before full dark," she confirmed. She rode through the open gate. Chester had left it unlatched, she noticed, so that it would swing open at a touch, and up the long road to the house, and the cottonwoods were making their dry summer sound in the breeze, and the kitchen garden looked more cared for than it had 2 weeks ago, the tomato plants staked and the herbs trimmed back into something approaching order. Chester was on the porch when she arrived, and he looked at her with the careful stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of a very strong reaction, and he said, "I am glad you came," in a voice that was entirely plain and entirely sincere. He had cooked honestly, as promised, a beef roast that had been in the Dutch oven since morning, potatoes from the garden that he had apparently been more successful with than she had observed, green beans that must have been canned from the previous year, cornbread that was slightly uneven but tasted exactly right. He set it on the table in the dining room, which had clearly been cleaned for the occasion, the long-accumulated dust of a room not often used replaced by the smell of beeswax and clean air. They sat across from each other and ate and talked, and the talking was easier now than it had been over the fence, easier in the way that two people become easier with each other when they have shared honest words and not regretted them. She asked about his cattle operation, and he told her about the breeding decisions he had been making over the past 2 years, moving away from the longhorn stock his father had favored, and toward the heavier-bodied breeds that were bringing better prices as the market changed, which was a decision that had taken courage and capital, and a clear reading of where the industry was going. He asked about her father's financial situation, and she told him the full of it without embarrassment, because embarrassment was a luxury she could not afford, and besides, she had done nothing wrong. It had been her father's debt and she had inherited it, and she was paying it down methodically, one good season at a time. "The drought is the main problem," she said. "If we get a good wet winter and spring next year, I can recover significantly." "I have been watching the same thing," he said. "My father always said this land was generous when it felt like it, and merciless when it did not. And the trick was to survive the merciless parts long enough to receive the generous ones." He sounds like a sensible man. He was. He was also stubborn as old leather and impossible to disagree with, but those qualities served him well out here. A pause. "He died 8 years ago, before Clara." Another pause, deliberate. "I mention that because I want you to understand that I was not always someone who lived alone behind a closed gate. I know what it is to have people in your life. I simply lost the ability to find my way back to it for a while." "And now?" she asked, and the question was quiet but not careful. It was direct, the way she was direct when something mattered. He looked at her across the table in the warm lamplight, and his face was open in a way she had not seen before, the careful stillness replaced by something rawer and more alive. "Now," he said, "I am having supper with you." After they ate, they went back to the porch, because the evening had cooled to something bearable, and the stars were beginning to come out over the mountains in the particular density that only exists far from cities, where there is no light but fire and lamp to dull them. They sat in the same 2 chairs, and Chester brought out coffee, and they drank it and watched the stars arrange themselves in the way stars always had and always would, indifferent to drought and debt and 4 years of closed gates. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "The 4 years," she said. Did you intend it to be that long? When you closed the gate the first time, was it meant to be permanent?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "The first time I closed it because I could not face anyone. Because when Clara died, everyone came the way people come, and they meant well, and I knew they meant well, but I could not, I had no words for what I was. I was not grief exactly, I was just empty. Like the house had been pulled out from under a roof I did not know was only standing because of what was underneath it." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "So I closed the gate. I said, just for now, just until I can find words." A long pause. "The problem with just for now is that if you are not careful, it becomes its own kind of permanent." "But you opened it," she said. "You rode up with a calf," he said. "You could have taken the calf and sent me back." He looked at her with those eyes that were warm dark, like old timber. "Yes," he said simply. "I could have." She rode home with the stars above her and the warm night pressing close, and Biscuit walked at a comfortable pace because the mare knew the road home as well as she knew anything, and Wilhelmina sat easy in the saddle and let herself feel, completely and without qualification, that something had begun. Something careful and clear-eyed and unhurried, rooted in the particular soil of 2 people who had both had hard years, and had come through them without lying to themselves about what the hard years had cost. She was 26 years old, and she had not been in love before, though she had come close enough once in San Antonio to understand what close felt like, which was how she knew that this was different. This was not close. This was the thing itself, beginning like all real things begin, not in a rush, but in the way a fire catches in dry grass, low and inevitable and spreading before you have fully registered that it has started. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that felt natural in the way that the right things feel natural, not because they require no effort, but because the effort is worthwhile and both people making it know why. Chester came to the Kendrick property twice more to help with work. Once with a section of corral fence that needed rebuilding, once when one of Wilhelmina's cows went down with a foot issue that Chester had more experience treating than she did, and she went to the Dawson property every Saturday evening for supper. Sometimes they rode together on Sunday afternoons, following the fence lines of both properties or riding the open range between them that was common ground. technically belonging to nobody and therefore, in practice, belonging to whoever needed it. They talked constantly when they were together and thought about each other constantly when they were not, which Wilhelmina acknowledged to herself without drama, because she was not the kind of woman who performed emotions for her own benefit. In early September, the county held its harvest social in the Harlan Grange Hall, an event that had been occurring in some form since before either of them was born, the kind of gathering that was partly practical and partly traditional, and partly just an excuse for people in isolated places to see each other, and confirm that everyone was still managing. Wilhelmina went because Dorothea Pratt had been asking her to attend since she had returned from San Antonio 4 years ago, and she felt she owed Dorothea one social appearance per year as a minimum. She arrived in the blue calico dress that she had now decided was her official dress for occasions that mattered. Chester Dawson arrived 20 minutes after she did. The effect of this on the Grange Hall was notable, though the people of Harlan County were, on the whole, too polite to make it immediately obvious. Chester Dawson had not been to a county social in 4 years. There were children present who had been in the world for 4 years, and had therefore never seen him in public. He walked in with the same unhurried, economical stride she had first observed at the gate, wearing a clean shirt and a hat that he took off when he came inside, and the room absorbed his presence in the way a room absorbs a sudden change in light, a collective, barely perceptible adjustment. He found her across the room, because she was easy to find tall for a woman, dark hair that she had put up for the occasion, the blue dress a clear signal in a room full of brown and gray and worn cotton. He made his way to her without appearing to rush, and when he reached her, he said, "Good evening, Miss Kendrick," in a voice that was the same as always steady and quiet, and she said, "Good evening, Mr. Dawson," and they both stood for a moment in the awareness of being in a public place together, which was a different thing from the fence line and the porch and the dining room table. Dorothea Pratt materialized at Wilhelmina's elbow approximately 4 seconds later, which was impressive navigation through a crowded room. "Chester Dawson," Dorothea said, with the warmth of a woman who had known him since he was a child. "It is very good to see you, Mrs. Pratt," Chester said, and something in him softened slightly in the way of a person encountering genuine welcome. "It has been too long." "It has been exactly 4 years, 1 month, and about 2 weeks, Dorothea said pleasantly. "But who is counting?" Chester looked at Wilhelmina with a slightly helpless expression, and she looked back at him with one that communicated clearly that he had walked into this on his own, and she was offering no rescue, and he made a sound that might have been, in a man with more practice at ease, a laugh. The evening proceeded. Chester was reintroduced to people he had been avoiding, and they were, on the whole, kind. The instinct in small communities toward those who have suffered, when the suffering is understood, inclines people to gentleness rather than the pointed questions they might otherwise indulge. Floyd Cutler shook Chester's hand and talked to him about cattle prices for 15 minutes with the manifest relief of a man who had been curious about something for 4 years and was now able to ask directly. Chester and Wilhelmina danced once, when the fiddles started up, because not dancing would have been the more conspicuous choice. He danced plainly, as he did everything, not with flourish but with a solid, attentive competence that meant she was never in doubt about where they were going, and he held her properly and with care. And when the music shifted from lively to slow, he did not find an excuse to step back, and they danced close in the way that the slow dances of the West permitted. And she could feel the warmth of his hand at her back through the calico, and she could see the line of his jaw and the particular quality of his attention when he was focused on something that mattered to him. "Is this all right?" he said, meaning the dance and meaning all the eyes in the room and meaning everything. "Yes," she said. "It is all right." He looked at her with the warm dark eyes and said, low, so only she could hear it, "I had forgotten what it was to look forward to something." Her heart did something in her chest that she did not have an immediate word for. She settled on wanting because that was the truest version of it. "I am glad you remembered," she said. October came with the first real relief from the summer heat, the temperatures dropping from punishing to merely difficult, and the grass on the range recovering slightly from its summer devastation. The cattle that had survived the worst of the summer were looking better, gaining back some of the condition they had lost, and there was a cautious hope moving through Harlan County that the winter and spring ahead might be wetter than the previous two. Chester Dawson had been coming to call formally now, not just for work reasons, but on Tuesday and Thursday evenings when he would ride to the Kendrick property and sit on the porch and talk until the stars came out. And Eli Grover had stopped making observations about it because he was a perceptive man who understood that the situation was what it was, and that Wilhelmina Kendrick was 26 years old and had spent the last 3 years managing a grief-struck ranch in a drought, and was entitled to whatever happiness she could locate. Samson Webb, who was 19 and earnest and had appointed himself, without being asked, as something of a protective presence, had taken a more direct approach. He had said to Wilhelmina one morning, with the careful diplomacy of someone navigating what they understood to be delicate territory, "Mr. Dawson seems like a good man, Miss Kendrick, from what I have seen." "He is," she had said. Samson had nodded, satisfied with this intelligence. On the first cool Tuesday of October, Chester arrived in the late afternoon, while Wilhelmina was in the kitchen going over the account ledger, the one true terror of her week. The numbers that told her exactly where she stood and how much further she had to go before the Kendrick ranch was clear of the debt her father had left. She heard hoofbeats and looked up and then went to the porch without stopping to change her clothes or her hair, because she had decided some weeks ago that the point of this was that Chester Dawson saw her as she actually was. He tied his horse at the post and came to the porch steps and looked at her with that particular quality of attention, and then he said, "I have been sitting with something for several weeks, and I think I would rather say it than continue sitting with it." She sat down in her chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited. He took his hat off and held it, which was his version of being nervous. She had come to understand. He looked out at the south pasture for a moment and then back at her. "I know that I am not easy," he said. "I know that I come with 4 years of having been alone, and the weight of that, and the habits of that, and the fact that I am still learning how to be present in the way I once was. I'm not the man I was at 30. I may be better in some ways and more difficult in others, and I cannot promise that I know yet which is which." He paused. "What I can tell you is that these past months have been the most alive I have felt since Clara died, and that is entirely because of you, because of the way you are. Your practicality and your honesty, and the way you are not afraid of much, and the way you sat on my porch and drank reconstituted lemonade and did not make it into anything more complicated than it was." She was very still. "I am 34 years old," he continued, "and I have no desire to spend the next 34 years the way I have spent the last 4. I would like, if you are willing, to spend them differently, to spend them with you. Whatever that means, courting properly, with whatever timeline makes sense to you. I am not in a hurry to get to anything before you are ready for it." He looked at her directly, holding his hat, in the long amber light of October. "But I wanted to be clear about what I am hoping for." Wilhelmina looked at him for a long time, this man who had spent 4 years behind a closed gate and had opened it for her, this man who made dry jokes about cows and reconstituted lemonade, and said everything that mattered in the plainest possible language, because he had learned what happened when things were left unsaid. "Chester," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and the effect of it on his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life, a kind of arrival, like watching someone come home. "I have been hoping for the same thing, since approximately the Tuesday I found your calf." He sat down in the other chair, and they sat together in the amber October light, and after a moment he reached across the space between the chairs and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, And they sat like that while the light changed and the stars came out. The courtship was, by the standards of Harlan County, both proper and somewhat accelerated, which was appropriate for two adults who were not young enough to pretend they did not know their own minds. Chester spoke to Eli Grover, because Wilhelmina had no male relatives in the county, and Eli was the closest thing to family she had. And Eli had said, as he reported it to Wilhelmina afterward with a kind of gruff satisfaction, "I told him you would manage perfectly well with or without him, and that the question was whether he was the kind of man who understood what he was getting into, and he said yes, he believed he did, and I believed him." The question came on a Sunday afternoon in early November, when they were riding the high ridge of the Dawson North Range, the ridge that gave the best view of the whole county spread out below, the patchwork of properties and pasture land, the line of the Pecos visible as a darker green thread in the distance, the mountains to the west going amber and purple in the afternoon light. It was cool enough for their breath to show faintly, and the horses walked slow and easy, and Chester pulled up at the highest point and looked at the view for a moment and then looked at her. He did not go down on one knee because there was nowhere to do so gracefully from horseback, and they were both practical people. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and brought out a ring, a modest band of gold with a small oval stone of dark garnet, which was the color of the red clay earth they were both standing on, which she would later think was perfect. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I would like you to come to the Dawson Ranch and help me make it into the kind of place it should be. And I would like to help you with the Kendrick Ranch in whatever way serves you best, whether that is keeping it operating separately or combining the two as you think is right. I would like to be your husband for a very long time, and I would like to be honest with you always as I have tried to be, because that is the only way I know how to be with you that feels right." He paused. "And I would like, if it is ever possible, to have a family with you, though I understand that is something built over time, not promised." She looked at him and the ring and the view spread below them and felt the whole of what was in her chest, this fullness that she had never quite had a shape for before but that she recognized now as the thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "Yes," she said, "to all of it, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she leaned across the space between their horses and kissed him, the first time, a brief and certain press of her mouth against his in the cold November air, and he kissed her back with a gentleness that was also somehow immense. The way still water is immense, and when they separated, they were both breathing slightly differently and looking at each other with the particular expression of people who have arrived somewhere that matters. They were married in December, on the 22nd, which was the solstice, the longest night of the year, and the turning point after which every day became incrementally brighter, which Dorothea Pratt said when she heard the date was either a very romantic choice or a very practical one, and Wilhelmina said she saw no reason it could not be both. The wedding was held in the Harlan Grange Hall, because the weather in December was not reliable enough for an outdoor ceremony, and because the Grange Hall was, in a county with no proper church building, the community gathering place for all significant occasions. Dorothea organized the food with the precision of a military campaign and the warmth of a woman who understood that occasions of significance should be properly fed. Floyd Cutler attended and wept, which surprised everyone including Floyd. Eli Grover wore his good shirt and stood near the front with the bearing of a man in attendance at something he has waited a long time to see. Sampson Webb, in the back, grinned through the entire ceremony with the unself-conscious joy of someone 19 years old, who had not yet learned to hide his feelings at appropriate moments, and Wilhelmina loved him for it. Chester Dawson stood at the front of the Grange Hall in a dark suit that he had clearly made recently and looked at Wilhelmina as she came down the makeshift aisle in the blue calico dress. She had looked for something more traditionally bridal and found nothing she liked better, and besides, it was the dress she had been wearing for every significant occasion these past months, and it seemed right to continue. And his face was fully, completely open in a way she had never quite seen it before. All the careful stillness replaced by something that was simply, plainly, unmistakably joy. She had not expected the vows to be the most difficult part. She had expected the nerves, the public nature of it, the weight of everyone watching. What she had not expected was to stand in front of this man and hear herself say the words to love and to cherish, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, and to feel the complete reality of them, the way they were not ceremony but fact, not tradition but truth, each word landing in her chest like a key in a lock. When it was over and he kissed her, properly this time, the room made a sound of collective warmth that was the Harlan County equivalent of a standing ovation. The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment in the best sense of the word, the adjustment of two established, independent people learning to share space and decisions and mornings and evenings. Chester was not always easy, and neither was she, and they both knew it. He had habits from 4 years of solitude that he caught himself in and worked to change. The instinct to withdraw when things were difficult, the tendency to make decisions without consulting anyone because there had been no one to consult. She had habits from 3 years of sole authority, the tendency to assume she knew best about things that were now shared, the occasional impatience with slowness when she could see the answer clearly. What made it work was that they talked. Not always easily, not always immediately, but they talked. Chester had said, on their wedding night, sitting together in the quiet of the Dawson house that was now her house too, that the only thing that had actually helped him in the years of grief was the eventual, painful decision to be honest about what was happening inside him, and that the only thing that had helped him return to the world was doing that honestly with her, without pretending to be further along than he was. "I will not always have it right," he said, "but I will always tell you where I am." "That is all I will ask," she said, "because I will do the same." The Kendrick Ranch, after considerable discussion, remained operational, Eli managing the day-to-day with Samson's help, with Wilhelmina riding out 2 or 3 times a week to handle decisions and oversight while Chester helped with the financial strategy and the cattle management. It was an unconventional arrangement by the standards of 1882, a woman continuing to operate her own property after marriage, but Chester had no investment in conventional for its own sake, only in what was right and what worked. The Kendrick cattle and the Dawson cattle were not combined. They ran their own operations as they always had, sharing the common range and cooperating on the hard days as good neighbors did, but each maintaining their independence. It suited both of them. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was, as the cautious hopeful had hoped, wetter than the previous 2. The rains came in January, slow and steady rains that soaked into the cracked earth and did not run off immediately the way the fierce summer rains did. The Pecos ran fuller than it had in 2 years. The grass, which had been hanging on by its roots in the topsoil, began to recover. By March it was apparent to both Chester and Wilhelmina that the drought had broken, not completely and not forever, because droughts never broke completely and forever in this country, but significantly enough to matter. In April, Wilhelmina told Chester, on a quiet evening after supper when they were sitting together at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them, that she was expecting a child. He was very still for a moment in the way that was his version of a very large feeling. Then he reached across the table and took her hand with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something extraordinary, and he said, "How are you? Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also terrified and very happy simultaneously." "That sounds exactly right," he said softly. He was attentive and practical in the way he was attentive and practical about everything important. He made sure she was not taking unnecessary risks on the range. He read everything he could find about the progress of pregnancy and childbirth. He took over a number of the heavier physical tasks around the ranch without being asked, and without making a production of it, and he had the quality that she valued most. He did not treat her as though she had become fragile or diminished. He treated her as the same capable woman she had always been, while also being attentive to what she needed. It was a precise balance, and he held it with the same steadiness he brought to everything. Dorothea Pratt was informed, and immediately took charge of planning in the way Dorothea took charge of everything, arriving once a week with practical items and advice, and the warm, unceasing interest of a woman who had done this herself and wanted to be useful. Eli Grover said, "That is good news, Miss Wilhelmina," because he had never once called her Mrs. Dawson, and she had long since stopped expecting him to. Sampson Webb, 19 and now 20, was visibly delighted in the way that young people are delighted by the evidence that the world continues to make new life. The child was born in December on the 17th, 5 days before the anniversary of their wedding, which Dorothea declared to be entirely appropriate. He was a boy, a substantial, considerably opinionated boy with dark hair, and even at birth, the suggestion of eyes that would be warm dark, like old timber. They named him James after Chester's father, with the middle name Henry after Wilhelmina's father, because both men had worked hard in this land and deserved to be remembered in it. Chester held his son in the parlor of the ranch house on the evening of the birth, and was very quiet for a long time, which was not unusual for him, except that his face had an expression Wilhelmina had not seen before, something so open and undefended that it was almost difficult to look at directly, the way you could not look directly at the sun. When he finally looked up and found her watching him, he did not try to arrange his face into anything different. "I was not sure," he said, "that I would have this again, something to build toward." She was tired in the specific way of a woman who has just done something enormous, but she was also aware of the fullness of this moment with a clarity that tiredness could not touch. "You have it," she said simply. He crossed to the bed and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at their son together. This red-faced, opinionated, perfect small person, who was going to make them both smarter and more patient and more exhausted than they had ever been. And outside the ranch house the winter stars were out over Harlan County, hard and bright in the cold, clear sky, the same stars that had always been there and always would be. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary sorrows and frustrations that were simply part of living in a hard country in a hard time, but with the solid, accumulating weight of a life built by people who were honest with themselves and each other. The drought returned briefly in 1885, a dry spring and summer that cost them some cattle and made the ledger uncomfortable for a year. Chester and Wilhelmina worked through it with the same approach they brought to everything, clearly together, without pretending it was less than it was. The Kendrick ranch's debt, which had been Wilhelmina's inheritance of difficulty, was paid off completely in 1886, which was a Tuesday in June that Wilhelmina marked in her ledger with 2 careful lines drawn through the final number, and then sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself a moment of pure, unqualified relief. She brought the ledger to Chester that evening and showed him the lines through the number, and he looked at it for a moment and then looked at her with the warm dark eyes and said, "Your father would be proud." "He would be," she said, "and he would not admit it for at least a week after thinking it." Chester smiled the smile that she had been collecting for 4 years now, the one that was her favorite version of him, quiet and real, with the warmth underneath fully visible. James Dawson, at 4 years old, was demonstrating a talent for escaping from wherever he was supposed to be that, Chester observed with great solemnity, was entirely inherited from Little Red, and not from either of his parents. Wilhelmina pointed out that Chester had said Little Red's talent for escape was in his character, not his breeding, and this theory needed revision given that it appeared to be hereditary after all. Chester said he would look into it and let her know his findings, and she threw a dish towel at him, which he caught. In 1887, their daughter arrived, a girl named Clara, because Wilhelmina had asked, one quiet evening the previous year, what Chester thought about the name, and he had been still for a long moment and then said, "I think Clara would have liked you enormously, and I think she would be glad that the name went forward in something good." He had looked at Wilhelmina steadily. "I think it is the right thing." Clara Dawson was born in March with a voice that suggested she intended to be heard. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stillness, which at 3 months of age manifested as a way of watching the world around her with focused, serious attention that made visitors comment that she seemed to be cataloging everything. James, at 4, regarded his sister with the philosophical pragmatism of a boy who had already learned to expect the unexpected. Dorothea Pratt, by this point, had essentially appointed herself honorary grandmother to both children, appearing weekly with food and advice, and the warm presence of someone who had loved these people through all the significant seasons of their adult lives. Eli Grover, at 50, had scaled back his work at the Kendrick Ranch but remained its foreman, and Sampson Webb, who was 24 and had started a small property of his own 3 miles south, came to help when the work was heavy and called it square against all the help he had received in the years he had spent on the Kendrick payroll. The Kendrick Ranch continued to operate. Wilhelmina rode its fence lines on Thursday mornings as she always had, and Chester came with her on the days when the work was more than her patience for, and they rode together in the easy silence of people who had no need to fill space. The gate of the Dawson Ranch stood open more often than not now, not always, because there were days when Chester needed the boundary, and Wilhelmina understood this without being asked to, because she understood that healing was not a single event but a continuous process, and that the gate being open most of the time was not less significant for being occasionally closed. What mattered was that it opened. Little Red, who had started all of this, lived to an extraordinary age for a steer. He was not put to market, by unspoken mutual agreement, and spent his years being, as Chester described him, a demonstration project for the hypothesis that a cow with no useful purpose other than symbolism could still justify his existence through symbolic value alone. He was, in the spring of 1888, still in the Dawson South pasture, still blinking at the world with wide, bewildered eyes, still occasionally finding his way through fence gaps that should not have been possible. On a warm April morning in 1888, 6 years after the Tuesday that Wilhelmina had found him under a cottonwood tree and recognized the D&" Circle brand, Chester pointed him out to 4-year-old James from the back of the gray horse, a new gray, a son of the original, and said, "That is Little Red. He is why we are a family." James considered this with the philosophical seriousness of a 4-year-old. "Because you needed a cow." "Because your mother brought him home," Chester said, and looked across at Wilhelmina, who was riding beside them on Biscuit's successor, a young buckskin mare of equally considerable wisdom, with 6-month-old Clara in the carrier against her chest. Wilhelmina met his eyes and held them in the warm April morning, with the mountains going green in the distance, and the grass recovering, and the picos running clear, and the gate of the Dawson Ranch standing open behind them. She held his eyes, and he held hers, and everything that had happened between a gate and 2 people who had needed each other without knowing it. The calf and the lemonade and the supper and the stars and the vows and the children and the years was in that look, plain and full and true. "Because I brought him home," she agreed. Chester Dawson reached across the space between their horses in the way he had once reached across the space between 2 chairs on a porch, and she took his hand in the way she always did, fingers through fingers, sure and certain, and they rode on together across the land that was theirs, and the land that was the world's, and the land that was nobody's, all of it green and open under the April sky. The gate of the Dawson Ranch was open, and it would open again tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days after that, because the woman who had ridden up with a stray calf had turned out to be the kind of thing that changed a gate's whole purpose. Not a barrier, but a beginning. Not a closing, but the widest possible welcome, for everything that was worth letting in. And there was, in that spring of 1888 in Harlan County, Texas, a good deal that was worth letting in. The ranch house had long since become a home, the kind of home that accumulates its character from the lives lived inside it rather than from any intentional decoration. The parlor had James's wooden blocks in one corner and Clara's basket in another, and on the mantelpiece there was the jar that had held the first honey Chester had brought across the Kendrick fence line, cleaned and empty now, but kept because some things were worth keeping. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cornbread, and the herbs from the garden that Wilhelmina had expanded the year before into something that was no longer struggling but thriving. The tomato plants staked properly, the pepper plants heavy with fruit in the summer, the kitchen windowsill crowded with drying bundles of sage and rosemary and thyme. The dining room table that had been cleaned for a single supper now held the daily evidence of a family homework attempted by a child too young for homework, but with definite opinions about it. Ledger books with their careful columns of numbers. The occasional hat left somewhere it should not have been left. A tin of horsehair wax and 2 pairs of mending gloves and a child's red handkerchief that had been washed but not yet returned to its owner. Chester still had his quiet. He had his mornings alone before the house woke up, sitting on the porch with coffee while the light came up over the East Range. And Wilhelmina had learned that these mornings were not solitude in the way the 4 years had been solitude. They were not withdrawal or absence, but simply a man taking the specific nourishment of early quiet before the day asked him for everything. And she gave them to him freely because she understood what she was giving and why it mattered. When she joined him on those mornings, which she did perhaps twice a week, she brought her own coffee and sat in her own chair and did not always speak, and those mornings were among her favorites of all the mornings there had been. The summer of 1888 came on with its familiar implacability, the heat returning as it always did, pressing down on the buffalo grass and the red clay roads and the cattle at the water's edge. Samson Webb, who had expanded his small property to something approaching a real operation, rode over on a Thursday to help with a branding that required extra hands, and brought with him a young woman named Patience, whom he introduced with the particular combination of casualness and pride that indicated they were considerably more than acquaintances. Patience was 22 and the daughter of a freedman farmer south of Harlan, and she had quick eyes and a dry wit that Wilhelmina recognized immediately as the kind of person she was going to like very much. She held Clara with the competence of someone who had held younger siblings, and Clara, who had firm opinions about who she permitted to hold her, offered no objections. "Are you intending to marry her?" Wilhelmina asked Samson privately, in the way she was entitled to ask him things after years of being his employer and something resembling an older sister. "I am working up to asking," Samson said. "Work faster," Wilhelmina said. "She will not wait indefinitely." Samson worked faster. By September, there was a wedding at the Pratt property Dorothea had offered her large backyard, which was better suited to a gathering than either of the small homesteads involved. And Wilhelmina stood with Chester and both their children in the afternoon sun and watched Samson Webb, 25 years old and incandescent with happiness, marry Patience. And she thought about how one thing always opened onto the next. How the gate that opened for a calf had opened onto a courtship that had opened onto a marriage that had opened onto children and neighbors, and this, the particular abundance of a life that had chosen to remain open. She looked at Chester beside her, holding Clara against his chest with the ease of a man entirely accustomed to the weight of small children, watching the ceremony with his warm dark eyes and the expression he had had since the morning of James's birth. That open, undefended quality, the joy he had stopped hiding once he remembered he was allowed to have it. He felt her looking and looked back, and the whole history of it was right there between them, in a single look. The gate, the calf, the lemonade, the fence-line conversation in the golden evening light, the October proposal on the North Ridge, the December wedding, the children, the years, the mornings on the porch and the evenings at the table, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days that had made up 6 years of a life she would not trade for anything, not for anything at all. Not for the smoothest path or the easiest road or the life without the drought years and the debt and the hardness that had made her who she was. She would not trade a single Tuesday of it. Chester leaned down very slightly and said, low, near her ear, "You are thinking about something." "I am thinking about Tuesdays," she said. He considered this for exactly the right amount of time because he knew the whole of the story the same as she did, and then he said with the dry, quiet humor that she had been collecting alongside all his smiles, "Little Red would be very pleased to know his contribution has been appreciated." "His contribution has been enormous," she said. "I will tell him," Chester said. "He will blink at me and then try to eat my shirt." She laughed, there in the September afternoon at the Webb patient's wedding, with Clara reaching up to investigate Chester's hat brim and James standing beside them with his bootlace untied, and the mountains going amber in the west, and Dorothea Pratt catching her eye from across the gathering with an expression of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. Harlan County lay around them in the long light, all its red clay roads and wire fences and scattered ranches and difficult, beautiful immensity, and the gate of the Dawson ranch stood open 4 miles north of here, unlatched and easy, the way it had been standing for more than 5 years now, since a woman had ridden up with a stray calf on a hot Tuesday morning in 1882, and a man had done the most significant thing he had done in 4 years. He had opened it wide. And everything, in the end and all the days after the end, had come through.